Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we are featuring a new book, A World More Equal, an Internationalist Perspective on the Cold War, written by Sandrine Kott of the University of Geneva and published by Columbia University Press 2 months ago. I'm Eric Arneson, the chair of the Washington History Seminar. Until last week, I was co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. In our traditional introductions, which Christian and I alternated in giving, we would note that the seminar, launched in 2010, was a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. Before March 2020, we gathered in person in the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and since the summer of that pandemic year, we have been gathering here online, assembling participants from across the country and the globe. But that description requires a change. The Washington History Seminar is no longer a collaborative venture of the AHA and the Wilson Center for one simple reason. For all intents and purposes, the Wilson Center is no more. Several weeks ago, as I understand it, President Trump issued yet another executive order, this one directing that the, quote, non-statutory components and functions of the Wilson Center should be eliminated consistent with applicable law, and that the performance of our statutory function should be reduced to a minimum, unquote. If my chronology is correct, last week, DOGE, the so-called Department of Governmental Efficiency, arrived at the Wilson Center and assumed control of its IT systems, and then the vast majority of the center's staff were placed on administrative leave, locked out of their systems, a prelude to eventual dismissal. And as of an hour or two ago, many folks on the Wilson Center's listserv received an announcement that the Wilson Center is, quote, no longer continuing with planned programming and activities, unquote, period, unsigned. What the future of the Wilson Center might be is anyone's guess, though it's safe to assume that the Wilson Center, as we've known it, is gone. Its congressional mission to symbolize and strengthen, quote, the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs, unquote, a thing of the past. I, for one, mourn the passing of a great institution, one that I've had the privilege of working with for almost a decade and a half. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that I'm deeply saddened that my official collaboration with my co-director, Christian Osterman, and his assistant, Pete Bierstecker, appears to be at an end. I've worked closely with Christian since the fall of 2013, and it's been a privilege and indeed an honor to share the seminar's responsibilities with him. But what does all this mean for this seminar? In addition to today's session, the seminar is scheduled to continue through early to mid-May, and continue we shall with the support of and the sponsorship of the American Historical Association. Beyond that, well, those discussions remain to be had. That's for another day. But I hope that you will continue to join us on Monday afternoons till the season's conclusion in just over a month's time. A few additional things before we really get going. First, my thanks to the good folks at the American Historical Association and Jake Purcell in particular for helping us carry on in these trying times. Second, please note our next session of the AHA-sponsored Washington History Seminar will take place in 2 weeks' time on Monday, April 21st at 4 p.m. We will reconvene then to discuss Aaron O'Halloran's East of Empire, Egypt, India, and the world between the wars. And we'll be joined by discussant Dane Kennedy, and we hope you join us. Third, on the logistics front, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on the Washington History Seminar's YouTube page, where many dozens of our past programs are archived. Fourth, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll call on as many folks as we can. Okay, now down to real business. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured author this afternoon, Sandrine Kott, Professor of Modern European History at the University of Geneva and a visiting professor at New York University. Her main fields of expertise are the history of social welfare and labor in France and Germany since the end of the 19th century, and labor relations in Eastern Bloc countries, particularly the German Democratic Republic. She has published over 90 articles in French, German, and American journals and collective volumes, and published 7 monographs and edited several collected volumes and special journal issues. And today, she is here to discuss with us her new book, A World More Equal, an Internationalist Perspective on the Cold War, recently published by Columbia University Press. Sandrine, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're delighted you could join us. The screen is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Eric, for this kind introduction. And I'm very, very sorry to be the first speaker after everything which happened to the Wilson Center. I mean, it's very, very sad. And I'm right now in Paris, and we speak about it a lot. And we're looking at it with a lot of sadness, and also we hope that everything will, and we hope that we can help in a certain way. So we see what we can do. So anyway, in a way, my book, A World More Equal. I mean, I think you can see my shared screen is a kind of counter narrative of what is happening right now in the USA, in the world. The topic of this book, in a certain way, came to me because I didn't think that I will once write something on the Cold War, which was not my topic. But I was working in the archives of the International Labour Organization because I wanted to know, I mean, to understand a little bit more how there was a convergence in looking at labor between Western and Eastern Europe in the 60s and the 70s. And while looking at that, I was very much intrigued by a report written by the general director of the office at that time, David Moss, a US citizen who had been very close to Roosevelt, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and who he was traveling to Eastern European countries, to Poland and Czechoslovakia, because he wanted to convince their leaders to remain in the International Labour Organization during the period 1948-1949 in particular. So he was in Poland and Czechoslovakia in 1949, and he writes a report. They have to write report when they travel abroad. And in this report, as you can see, there is this part of the report in which he states, in the US states, there was a fear of the USSR, but there was a terrible misunderstanding and misconception between East and West. In the United States, there were 2 schools of thought. One of them wished a strong militaristic policy towards the USSR, and the other, to which the DG, I mean himself, belonged, which felt that conciliation was desirable and possible. This later school was in ascendancy, and there would be a great difference visible in the US policy within the period of 12 months. And it is written in 1949. So I was really very surprised. So of course, as you can see, I mean, this part is crossed in red and left out of the final report. That's why it's very important, in particular for international organizations, to look at the archives and not just to look at the final reports, because the final reports are erasing all the discussion which are going on. So anyway, I could have ignored that and seeing it merely as a kind of diplomatic, way of talking to the people in the East. Also, I mean, they wouldn't see this report anyway. But I decided to take it seriously and to try to understand what was behind that. So I began, and I was thinking that maybe if we look at this period through the eyes of international organization, we get a kind of different stories than the one which is a kind of standard narrative on the Cold War, meaning this opposition between the Soviet Union and the USA. So I began to inquire in different archives of different international organizations. I began with the ones in Geneva because they're very rich, by the way, and also because they were closer from where I live. And so it's my first archives, International Labour Organization, because this organization has very, very good archives. And then the second one, which has also good archive, which is also in Geneva, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. And then, you know, I also looked at other archives. Not all of them are just mentioned here, but a lot of them. And and this book is in a certain way the kind of new narrative of the period based on what I've done with this archive. So this book is not an account of the Cold War, nor a history of international organization in the Cold War, during the Cold War, but it is a history of the period through the lens or through the eyes of international organization, and in particular through the eyes of the secretariats of international organization, meaning people who are working, the officials of the international organization, and also the experts, which are who are coming from outside of the organization, but who are assembled in a certain way on certain topics, which are chosen by the official. So I'm not saying that there was no conflict in international organization. Of course, there were a lot of conflict in international organizations. There were also a lot of spying and so on and so forth. We know that. But this part of the story has been told. And what I found by looking at the archives of international organization is that there is another part of the story which has not been told. And I decided to tell this other part of the story. Of course, there is also an additional thing which is interesting when you look at the world through the eyes of international organization, is that you also can find, I mean, you can also focus on other countries, not the biggest country, not the USSR and the USA, which in a certain way are not so important, are not so in the Secretariat in particular. I'm not talking about the General Assembly or the Security Council and so on, but in the Secretariat of the organization, they're not that prominent, in particular if you look at the Economic Commission for Europe, for example, or even in the International Labour Organization. And so there is more room for other kind of middle-sized country like France, Great Britain, Federal Republic of Germany, and in the East in particular, it's what I was interested in, Poland and Czechoslovakia, which have been very important because they were already there in the League of Nations. So there is a long tradition of being international, which is not the case for the Soviet Union. So up to the 50s, I mean, the Soviets have really problems to get involved in international organizations because they had problems, you know, sending good people to international organizations. So, another very important actor that we find, and we can hear their voice in international organizations, are what we now call the Global South, but what was called the Third World countries. And through the Third World countries and through the Eastern European actors, then, I mean, the main issue which pops up in a certain way and which is important is the question of global inequality or global equality. That became, in fact, and very early on, the central concern of what we can see and how the international organizations, civil servants and experts were looking at the world. Because for them, in order to ensure peace, international experts in particular defended and promoted the idea that global inequality had to be corrected and in all these imbalances had to be regulated. They really believed that it was necessary and possible to organize what I call a world more equal. of course, is world more equal, and that goes with, of course, all the development policies and so on, which have been implemented. Let me, okay. Okay, here it is. So all the expanded program of technical assistance already in the 1947, 1948, 1949, of course, which is not only very often, I mean, it is explained by the Truman point for discourse and so on and so forth, but I mean, other people, and it's clear also that it has been pushed by other actors and not just by the US, in particular by third world countries. So all these development programs have been an answer to this question of inequality, global inequality, which was seen really as a threat for the peace of the world. So, and in fact, it really began in Europe, and it really began already during the war. And in particular, if you look at this quotation of Paul Rosenstein-Rodan, who is a Polish economist who has worked later at the World Bank, what he states, I mean, it's an oral history project, it's an interview which comes later, but it's important to listen to what he's saying. And during the war, I became interested in the problem of underdeveloped countries. So it was his main focus. And he was part of a committee in Great Britain with a representative of allied governments of Eastern Europe on it. And he states Eastern and Southeastern Europe served only as a model of underdeveloped country. So, and it's an important quotation because in fact, what happens is that in international organization, in particular, the expert on development looked at this part of the world as a kind of first European periphery. And then they implemented development model for the Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And it's, in fact, it has a tradition already in the League of Nations. It's not new for the UN period. And then, they use this country as a kind of blueprint for exporting this development model to the global South. So, and I was surprised myself looking at or the archives of the UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, and before that of the expanded program of technical assistance, that in fact the first country who received some of the development programs were not in the global South, but were in Eastern Europe, in particular in Poland, and not Czechoslovakia, but in particular Poland and Bulgaria. So there is this idea that the first thing to do is really to develop Europe. And why is it important to develop Europe? Because as Gunnar Myrdal, which is a director, the chair, which is chairing the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which was set up in 1947, it's only by fostering, I mean, Gunnar Myrdal is a Swedish social democrat, it's only by fostering economic development throughout all Europe, both between East and West and between advanced and backward countries, that rapid improvement in production and living standard could be achieved for Europe itself. And he adds, Europe is going forward, not back. A new balance between East and West must come, but it will not be the old one that left the East in a semi-colonial state. So he looks, in fact, at Eastern Europe in this kind of colonial framework, something which was already the way the League of Nations officials were looking at Eastern Europe before the Cold War. So there is a long history of looking at Eastern Europe as an underdeveloped Europe, as they say, Europe B at that time. And in fact, that the thing which is interesting is that even though there has been a change of regime and so on and so forth, I mean, the focus was still on the development of this part of Europe. And the people, you can understand that because as we see, Gunnar Myrdal is a social democrat, and the international organization became, during that period, a kind of platform for East-West exchanges. That's why they were important. And in particular, through a group of people who were an international group of democratic socialists or social democrats in a certain way. And these social democrats, and it's something which is which has been, I'm not the only person to say that. There is another historian who is working on this group, Katja Naumann in Leipzig. And these people are coming from a particular a group of socialists, what was called the small internationalists. This group of socialists who have been resistance fighters active in Stockholm between 1942 and 1945. And these people were connected to each other. And it's not the Socialist International, because the Socialist International was not active during the war. But it's this group of people, among which you can find Willy Brandt, Bruno Kreisky, Gunnar Myrdal, and in the East also a lot of socialists. These socialists will have to join the Communist Party in the East, because as you know, there will be a forced merger between the Social Democracy and the Communist Party. But some of them, and that's interesting, they're part of the Communist Party, but they are former Social Democrats, and they are still very much linked to the Western Social Democrat. And we see that also in international organization, because when they exchange letters and correspondence and so on, they know each other very well, and they say dear friends and so on and so forth. And when you look at their biography, you see that in fact they are just linked by their common past in social democracy, which is very important to remember. There's an additional layer to that, is that the reason why, in fact, these people were bound to each other is because they have been fighting fascism with each other. And it's something that we tend to forget, because the Cold War is just covering all the post-war period. But the post-war period is not just, a Cold War period. It's also a period of reconstruction. It's also a period of anti-fascism. Most of these people have been brought together, and in particular the UN itself, the United Nations, has been, as we know, set up during the war itself, not as an organization, but as a war alliance. And it was a war alliance against fascism. And a lot of people who were in this international organization were committed anti-fascists, beginning with, for example, Morse, I talked about at the beginning, who was a US citizen, but who have been in the US Army liberating Europe. And the thing which I found also very surprising when I was looking at the archives, when David Morse went to Poland and Czechoslovakia, he was greeted very warmly. And one of the reasons why he was greeted warmly is because he was supposed to have liberated Mauthausen, in which there were many social democrats and communists imprisoned. And I was really surprised just to read that, for example, Cyrankiewicz, which was the Polish prime minister, really greeted Morse, saying that they had met in Mauthausen. We don't know if they have met in Mauthausen, but it's a sign. It's just a rallying sign that they've been together, that they were together fighting against a common enemy, and this common enemy were the fascists. And this anti-fascism, which has been in a certain way forgotten because of the Cold War, is very important in order to understand what has been going on, in particular in international organizations. So, and there have been places in which this kind of encounters have been very vivid, very lively, like Vienna. And of course, Vienna is in Austria, Kreisky, and so on. Kreisky was also part of this network of social democrats, and also all the social democrats were heavily anti-communist, of course, because they knew exactly why. What happened to the social democrats themselves. It's not that they believed in communism or that they were sympathetic to communism, but they were in a certain way thinking that this kind of pan-European movement was absolutely crucial in order to keep a peaceful Europe. So in Vienna, you had all these international organizations which have been set up, and all these International Agency for Atomic Energy, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, IASA, International Institute for Applied System Analysis, or the European Center for Research and Coordination. They were all places in which, and all these organizations have been studied. I mean, they have good archives, not all of them, but some of them have good archives. They've been studied, and we know that there were really places in which Eastern and Western Europeans were working together. And for IASA, also US and Soviet scientists were working together. So, and this could have, in particular, very important impact on certain countries like Bulgaria and the computers and so on and so forth. But it's maybe it's a story that we could just talk about later in the Q&A. So, and the thing which is, and it's at the third step of the presentation and the last one, the thing which is interesting is that you know, I mean, all these development programs which have been set up and developed also for Eastern Europe as a kind of first periphery of Europe, was then exported to the global south. It's something that I found also very interesting, that in particular the UNDP program, the United Nations Development Program, they encourage the Eastern Europeans just to use the knowledge that they get from the Western Europeans to export this knowledge to the global south. And the UN was very important as a place for the circulation of knowledge between West, East, and South. And also because the UN was also the place in which the visibilization of the third world was made possible. And you see, for example, this picture, which is a very interesting picture, because if you look at the people, that's for a lot of them, that's the first time that they are really representing their country in the UN. They're very proud about it. That's a big library of the UN in Geneva, which is now the archive. By the way, it's absolutely a beautiful, beautiful room. And that's a constitutive meeting of the G77 in Geneva, and also the place where you have the first UNCTAD, so United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. So, and again, you know, there is a story, a cross story between Eastern and Eastern Europe and the global south here, because the mastermind between UNCTAD is in fact the Polish economist Władysław Malinowski, who was also working at the head of the Department of Economic Affairs in the UN. And if you look at the first Director General of the UNCTAD, Raúl Prebisch, I mean, very well-known Argentinian economist. I mean, Raúl Prebisch has formulated, as we know, this theory of dependence. But this theory of independence is also very much influenced by the theories of the Romanian economist Mihail Malinowski. So, Manoilescu, excuse me. So, and during the interwar period. So there is again, you know, a kind of transition between West, East, and the global south, and that cumulates. But I finish here because I want to give you more time for the question. And that cumulates with the new international economic order, which, as we know, will fail. And we enter then in the mid of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s in a new era, which has been called the neoliberal era. That we should discuss what we mean with that. But it's in a certain way what I wanted to explain to you. I mean, this road not taken, this road for kind of more equal world, which was a circulation, which was based on the circulation of knowledge and development between these three worlds of the Cold War, and with a particular emphasis on the kind of middle-sized country in Western, Eastern, and global South and third world countries. Okay, so.
Thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind ending the share screen.
Yeah, I do that. Okay. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Sandrine, thank you so much. Before I introduce our commentator this afternoon, let me remind you that you can join the discussion conversation in two different ways. You can use the raise hand function on Zoom, in which case we call on you, you unmute yourself, and you pose the question in your own voice. You can also write out questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, in which case I read your questions in my own voice. We prefer the raise hand function, but both are fine. And no need to wait. You can get in the queue now, should you so desire. Our commentator this afternoon is Mark Kramer, the director of the Cold War Studies Project at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. He's worked extensively in the newly opened archives in the former Warsaw Pact countries and several Western European countries. He edits both the Harvard Cold War Studies book series and the peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Cold War Studies. And I should note, he's the author and or editor of several books and has written nearly 200 articles on a variety of subjects. Mark, thanks for joining us this afternoon. The Zoom screen, all yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. And my thanks both to you and to Peter Bierstecker for organizing this. Peter, unfortunately, is now one of those on administrative leave from the Wilson Center. I actually worked considerably longer with the Wilson Center, more than 30 years, was involved with the Cold War International History Project from the very beginning, was an active participant in it. And then the History and Public Policy program, which was set up somewhat later, also worked very closely with, and also more generally with the Wilson Center. And I deeply regret the action that was taken in connection with the presidential executive order on the 14th of March. There was no explanation offered for that executive order. There still has been none. I find it baffling, a disservice to U.S. security interest and U.S. more broadly U.S. national interest. The Wilson Center was a highly prestigious organization, known all around the world as a really significant and excellent source of nonpartisan expertise on international affairs. So let me just say that I will have more to say about that in a future essay that should be out soon. So let me turn to the book, which is a translation. And so there are a few things I note that may be the fault of the translator. I think that Sandrine presented it well, although I wish she had said more about the subsequent chapters, because she focused much more on the first two chapters. I very much like the second chapter in particular. I think there is some excellent material in there. and would recommend it. The first chapter I'm somewhat less fond of, and some of the other parts of the book. So my critique of it will be in the context of admiring the book. There are, however, some ambiguities and problems with it that I'm going to highlight. It's not in any way to neglect the strengths of the book, but I figure as a commentator, I might as well focus on what I see as problems. So if you look at the international system during any period, whether it's 1945 to 1989 or some other period, there are numerous ways of characterizing it. And so if you describe the 1945 to 1989 period as the Cold War, it in no way means that other processes and trends and activities were not going on. On the contrary, scholars during the Cold War were well aware of all of the international organizations that are discussed in the book. They were certainly well aware of the process of decolonization, the rise of many newly independent former colonies in Africa and Asia, the push for a new international economic order, and other such developments. There was extensive academic literature on all of those topics that was produced during the Cold War. So describing it as the Cold War does not in any way mean that people somehow were fixated only on the US-Soviet rivalry. On the contrary, that good scholarship took account of that. Scholars of international relations set those trends into larger perspective, as say Hedley Bull did in his book, The Anarchical Society, which came out in 1977. Bull died at the young age of cancer at age 52 in 1985. But at the time he died, he was busy working on a book, titled The Revolt Against Western Dominance, regarding decolonization and its aftermath, especially he dates decolonization well before the Second World War, particularly Japan's drive for the greater East Asian prosperity sphere and other developments that represented this revolt against Western dominance. But that's basically, that title, I think, captures his argument quite well, that it was a notion of a revolt against Western dominance, which in my view is a better characterization of the push among third world countries, the growing number of them, for a new place in the world. And this is where I get to some of the ambiguity in the book about what is meant by equality. The notion of equality implies that third world governments strove for equality among states. And that, again, the book isn't clear on this, whether it means equality among individual countries, whether it means greater equality of income distribution, or numerous other ways you can define equality. If you look at indices in the Correlates of War Project or any number of other databases, it's easy to see that, in fact, states are highly unequal, no matter what you do. There will never be a situation in which Mali and say the United States or Great Britain or other countries are going to be equal in the indices given there. It's not to say that Mali is treated equally in the United Nations and other international organizations. So it's ironic that those very international organizations, in fact, confer an equality that is not necessarily there in other respects. So even if one believes that equality among states would be desirable, the fact is that states are highly unequal in their material endowments, demographic complexion, economic strength, and economic potential, military capabilities, etc. It's not to say that the states that are stronger in those indices should be treated better or should be seen as better or more virtuous than states that are much smaller. But still, it would have been helpful to have a clearer definition of what is meant by equality. Part of this is that there was a great deal of hypocrisy during the Cold War about income and social equality. So, for example, OPEC countries, and OPEC has a small role here, but still, OPEC countries had truly been interested in, quote, equality, unquote. They would have redistributed their oil revenues, at least at home, and would have also presumably given some of it to countries that lacked energy resources. They, of course, did nothing of the sort. There was no effort to promote equality in that sense. I would also recommend that if there is a revised edition of the book, you take a look at the book that Tony Atkinson, the late Anthony Atkinson, edited called The Handbook of Income Distribution, which deals quite centrally with this question of how to define equality and looking at it in the international system, but also domestically. And Atkinson himself with John Micklethwaite had a very good essay in that book about income distribution in the Soviet Union. And they show that all of the Soviet claims about equality and so forth were actually phony, that income distribution, particularly during the Stalin and Brezhnev eras, was highly unequal in the Soviet Union. They were using newly available data to go about this. During the Nikita Khrushchev period, there was a leveling, and so it was more in line with Soviet rhetoric. But during the Stalin period in particular, and also the Brezhnev period, there was a high degree of inequality. So in thinking about equality in this book, it would be helpful to look at, to provide some indicators of, if you're talking about income equality or income inequality, the distribution, then it would be helpful to look at some of the concrete indicators. Because, for example, the greatest progress toward reducing income inequality occurred in Western Europe during the Cold War, where generous welfare states were established. And that did more to reduce inequality in income distribution than any of the so-called planist programs that you refer to here. That the establishment of generous welfare states, which was a conscious effort domestically in these countries, but did a great deal to reduce inequality of income distribution. Similarly, the greatest progress in reducing poverty in the world, which is very important if you're interested in equality, the greatest progress in reducing poverty in the world occurred through liberalization of international trade. That was done in conjunction with the Bretton Woods agreements, but then ended up being promoted by the general agreement, by GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, even though the initial plan had been for the International Trade Organization. But the successive rounds of trade liberalization and the spread of liberal capitalist institutions did far more to reduce poverty in the world than any of the alternatives. If you look at average income in the world in 1945 and compare it, say, to 1990, and particularly after China and India were more fully integrated into the international economic system. That is, at the time that Mao Zedong died in 1976, China was one of the poorest countries on earth, extremely poor. It had been put through a series of catastrophic crises by Mao himself, inflicted on his own country, and as a result was extremely poor. The momentous decision by Mao's main successor, Deng Xiaoping, to integrate China into the international economy, even though on somewhat strange terms, but had the enormously beneficial effect for China of greatly reducing poverty and also increasing overall average income in the country, the income per capita, and certainly average income overall. So I say this because the book often takes the side of what it calls it's fairly, I mean, again, I think it's a sophisticated book. At the same time, there's no doubt that Sandrine takes the side of leftist social democrats, socialists, she alternatively describes them in the book. And, I would be cautious about that, because much of the reduction in inequality, and certainly much of the reduction of poverty, occurred precisely because of the capitalist development that went on. So I know I'm running out of time, but let me just add a couple of words here. So the planist, so-called planist approaches, which I would call centrally planned approaches to economic development, really, I think, were discredited by what happened during the Cold War. And certainly, as compared to free trade, I would go with free trade any day, even though I know the current US president wouldn't. Let me also just say a few words that also made me uneasy. I think, for example, the book's, this is in chapter 1, I believe, the book's account of the development of the Marshall Plan is one-sided. Numerous, again, Sandrine points out there's an extensive literature about the Marshall Plan. And going back to the Cold War period, but particularly in the post-Cold War period, when it's overwhelming, the amount of literature. And it shows that US officials were not uniform. They were not united in their views, that some key figures in the US government were hoping that the East European countries would join the Marshall Plan. It wasn't simply to try to develop a fortress against the East European countries. And they were disappointed that the East European countries didn't join. And of course, the reason that they didn't join is that the Soviet Union ordered them not to. This comes across more, I think it's in chapter 2, where there's a very good discussion of Stalin's deep aversion to international organizations that he couldn't totally control. And even it was during Stalin's lifetime, that the only significant international organization created within the Soviet bloc was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And as Sandrine notes, that it didn't have all that much substance. In fact, one of the major purposes of it at the beginning was to coordinate sanctions against Yugoslavia, which had been expelled from the Soviet bloc by Stalin. But in any case, I also think the book underestimates the extent to which the West European countries were eager to maintain a strong US economic, political, and military presence in Europe. This is the thrust of Georg Lundestadt's notion of an empire by invitation. For example, Sandrine writes, if I have it here, unfortunately, I don't have a hard copy of the book, but I transcribed here. In both parts of Europe, this is Sandrine, in both parts of Europe, and especially in the East, these actors, meaning those that wanted more pan-European solutions, tried to escape the domination of the hegemonic powers that were the United States and the Soviet Union. I mean, that is certainly true about many in Eastern Europe. It is nowhere near as true about Western Europe, where actually many, until the outbreak of the Korean War, many were fearful that the United States was going to retreat into its own continent and not be involved in Europe. And in fact, there were many in the US Congress who favored doing that, and many also even in the Truman administration who thought it was inevitable that the United States would basically disavow its ties with Europe. So West Europeans were very much a part of everything that occurred, including the formation of NATO. And then another point that, and again, I'm quoting from Sandrine, is within the Bretton Woods institutions dominated by the United States, actors opposed to national and international regulation could see the division of the world into two blocks as an opportunity to preserve the domination of economically and politically less powerful countries. I mean, again, to some extent that's true, but it's also, it really needs to be very sharply qualified. The United States, for example, with the Marshall Plan, encouraging regional approaches, that is European approaches, was trying to foster not the economic domination of Western Europe, but in fact quite the opposite, the rise of a prosperous, powerful Europe that would be resistant to communist subversion. So you know, it's simplistic to say that the United States was simply out to preserve its own domination. There are numerous other questionable assertions, but because I've already gone past my time, let me just very quickly add that with regard to the new international economic order, and which I realize Sandrine also ran out of time and didn't really have an opportunity to discuss what she covers in the book. There was also a new international information order that was subsequently developed. The United States and the Soviet Union actually worked together to try to thwart the new international information order, especially the sharing of what would you call it? You know, the opportunity for various third world countries to control the spectrum. So the sharing of the spectrum, both the United States and the Soviet Union had very little interest in it. In fact, in many cases, they thwarted these attempts to redesign the international telecommunications order. And then finally, let me say, this may well be the fault of the translator. I haven't seen the original version of the book, so I'm relying simply on the translation. There's some annoying, you know, they're small for the most part, but annoying mistakes like the European Recovery Program, as it was known, is referred to as the Europe Recovery Plan, or more significant, Henry Morgenthau, who was the U.S. Treasury Secretary, who put together, you know, who briefly advocated the Morgenthau Plan, is referred to as Hans Morgenthau. And Hans Morgenthau was a theorist of international relations who was unrelated to Henry Morgenthau. You know, Hans Morgenthau was a refugee from Germany who made a significant career as a realist theorist of international relations. George Kennan is referred to as, during the planning, the development of the Marshall Plan, is referred to as ambassador to the USSR, which Kennan at the time was really head of the State Department's policy planning staff. He was very briefly appointed ambassador to the USSR in 1952, but Moscow refused to accept his credentials, so he had to be pulled out, never had a stint as ambassador to the USSR. But certainly in 1947-48, he was head of the policy planning staff and is famous in that role. Common form is at one point referred to as Comintern, even though I know that Sandrine knows the difference. You know, she refers to both organizations. Walt Rostow, whose name was Walt, not Walter, he's repeatedly referred to here as Walter Rostow. His name was Walt Whitman Rostow, and when someone would refer to him as Walter, he very quickly corrected it. So, and again, there are numerous other things like that. These may well be the fault of the translator. But I wish that Columbia University Press had done a better job of editing the book. That said, let me end on a note of appreciation for a lively and often very interesting effort to rethink the role of international organizations during the Cold War. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. Sandrine, there are some things on the table. If you would like to respond to them, this would be a time to do it. We can get a conversation going.
Okay, so thank you for your remarks and for the small corrections. You know, I mean, always appreciated. As for inequality, I think that you misunderstood what I wanted to write, or maybe you didn't exactly write the book I have written. Because, of course, I mean, my book was not about evaluating the countries against each other or with each other or whatever, you know, but it was just looking at the whole thing through the eyes of the officials of international organizations and experts and their and their efforts in a certain way to make the war not equal but more equal, which is something very different. And the way they want to make it more equal is just mainly by development, which doesn't mean that they don't know that they certainly know, they know very well that the world is not, that all the countries in the world are not equal. So, and then, of course, related to that, when you mention the welfare state, of course, I mean, as you know, the welfare state has not been pushed by people on the right, but not, I mean, in that time, I'm an expert of the welfare state, so I could speak for hours on the welfare state. But in that period, I mean, the people who were pushing for the welfare state were, as we know, social democrats. So, and it means that these people who were pushing in a certain way in international organization for a world more equal were the same people who were also pushing inside their own countries for a society more equal. So this question of equality was absolutely crucial for these people, for this group of people. And they were not the only one, of course. You could add the Christian Democrats in particular, who were also very important in pushing for the welfare state in the same period, which is in a certain way very different from what happened before in the interwar period, and in particular at the end of the 19th century, during which, I mean, social laws were pushed by other groups of people and other people. So, but in that period, this question of less inequality, which doesn't mean complete equality. I mean, none of these people were really fighting for complete equality, none of them. Certainly not, even not the communists, as you rightly say. So, where it was this idea that if you have too much inequality, then the peace of the world is in danger, and the peace inside each country is in danger. It's very clear when you look at the archives of, for example, of the International Labor Organization, which has been made exactly for that. Just to fight against revolution, upheaval, as they say. And why? Because if you have too much inequality, then you will have upheaval in one country and in the world in general. And it was already the case, I mean, their fear in 1919 when the International Labour Organization was created. So the question of inequality is also, it's not just a question of counting how much you have on, but it's a question of how you want to organize the world. Do you want to organize the world the way, I mean, your president is organizing it right now? So that's complete inequality. It's exactly what he wants. So there was a time in the world, in the history of the world, where people were thinking that if you want to have a world which is more harmonious, more peaceful, then it's better to have a little bit more equality, more equal, which doesn't mean entirely equal, of course. So that's what I wanted to say. So then about planning, you know, there is two sorts of planning in that period. There is the central planning economy. I mean, what you would certainly label command economy. And there is another planning, which is an indicative planning. And as you might know, in France, there was a planning, an Institut du Plan. Okay, so the French economy was planned, but it was an indicative planning. And for example, when Gunnar Myrdal comes to Stanford, I think it's 1969, he held a big conference and he says, economy is about planning. In that time, everybody was thinking, I mean, of course, I mean, certainly not the extra, the far, the libertarian or whatever. I mean, they didn't exist at that time, but I mean, the far liberal, I mean, the people the US is exceptional in that. In that, I mean, it's important to know that the US is certainly not, I mean, a kind of model for the world in the period 50-60. And when you say that empire by invitation, I know that's an interpretation. But if you look at the way people were speaking in the United Economic Commission for Europe, I mean, I tell you, US was not an empire by invitation in that period, even not by Walter Rousseau himself, who was saying that in fact the US was selling too much coal to Europe, and that in fact coal should in fact be redistributed inside Europe itself. So it's certainly there were people who wanted to have the US by invitation as an empire, but there were a lot of people who were not in favor of that. So, and what you see in particular in the United Nations Commission for Europe, Economic Commission for Europe, is that they would have much more preferred to have a kind of integrated Europe than to have an empire by invitation. So, and exactly it's that what you don't see if you are just looking at the US archives, or if you're just looking at the NATO archive or this kind of thing. And that's why it is interesting also to look at other archives and to look at other actors, and then you get a kind of different perspective, which is also valuable. Okay, so I just want to finish here because if we want to have more questions.
Thank you very much. We've got a few questions in the Q&A, but I want to pose one or two of my own first, and other people can get into the queue. And the first concerns one of the slides that you showed, and you cite this in the book, and this is Gunnar Myrdal writing in 1948, that it is only by fostering economic development throughout all Europe, both between East and West, and between advanced and backward countries, that rapid improvement in production and living standards could be achieved, unquote. And so if this pertains to Europe itself, am I misreading this and seeing him as simply being wrong to a certain degree? Western Europe did achieve considerable economic advances in the years that followed the Marshall Plan for a variety of reasons that did not involve the development throughout all of Europe. So could you just say a bit more about what Myrdal was talking about, and then how economic development was possible, certainly in the West Europe, but also various Eastern and Central European states would say that they too would at least claim that they were making significant economic progress despite the barrier between the two regions?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, this question, if in order to answer this question, it's important to go back to the interwar period. I mean, the main issue in the interwar period was exactly that. There's kind of imbalance between Eastern and Western Europe. And if you look at the, for example, League of Nations, I mean, the first technical programs that they were sending were technical assistance program to Eastern Europeans and to Eastern Europe, because what they wanted to have was a kind of integrated Europe, and an economic integrated Europe, because they were saying, and Walter Rousseau, there is another quotation of Walter Rousseau in the archives of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, in which he says that, in fact, the complementarity between these two parts of Europe is the most important thing, and that it's also important in order, for Europe to be a kind of integrated continent, and not to depend of the United States, in particular for coal and other products like that. So there is a long tradition, yeah, a certain long tradition of these kind of plans for having an integrated Europe. And of course, in 1948, Gunnar Myrdal is certainly completely aware of the fact, because of Marshall Plan and so on and so forth, that it's in a way that it's clear that it won't really happen. But for him, it's still, you know, this kind of project of an integrated Europe, which for him and for a lot of people in the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe was the only way of having a kind of balanced Europe, and certainly for the smaller country not being dependent on bigger economy.
Could I just very quickly pick up on what Eric said? Is it wasn't just people like Gunnar Myrdal, you know, who both he and his wife Alva were very prominent Swedish socialists, and they you know, which is mentioned in the book, but it wasn't just people like that. It was in general most international economic specialists would have thought that the exclusion of a significant region of Europe would have very far-reaching consequences. And what is striking about what actually happened is it didn't. You know, as you mentioned, Eric, Western Europe became a very prosperous region, and whereas East Central Europe, you know, certainly advanced, but was much poorer by comparison. And international economic specialists had thought that there would be a greater impact on Europe as a whole, whereas the major impact was in fact in the region that was excluded mostly because of Stalin's dictates. So I mean, again, there were many in Western Europe. And in fact, the Federal Republic of Germany did significantly expand its trade relations with East Central European countries after they lost their, you know, there was a period, especially in the late 40s and 50s, when many, especially in Poland and Czechoslovakia, were deeply reluctant to have ties with Germany. But over time that faded, and in fact, the Federal Republic developed extensive ties with the East Central European countries. But that was possible only after Stalin's death and only after the East Central European countries lost their reluctance about dealing with Germany and other things of that sort. But it is striking that the divide between East Central Europe and Western Europe did not prevent the prosperity of Western Europe. On the contrary, you know, they reached unprecedented levels of prosperity.
Yeah, but of course, Western Europe was much more developed even before. And exactly what you're saying about West Germany, and I completely agree with you. I mean, we are editing together with other colleagues a special issue on that, on the economic relationship between Western and Eastern Europe, and in particular Western Germany. And I looked at the archives, and it's clear that there was a development of economic relation. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's clear that Western Europe was much more prosperous than Eastern Europe, but it was already like that before. I mean, Eastern Europe was already as Gunnar Myrdal described, and rightly so, in a kind of semi-colonial situation vis-à-vis Western Europe. And then, Western Europe developed a certain model, and as we know, it's an addition of capitalism and welfare protection. I mean, something which makes Western Europe as a kind of what can be called Euro-capitalism, or what you mean, very different from the US, very, very different from the US as a model, and more human, I would say. More balanced, in which the people are more protected, and you're right, much more prosperous than Eastern Europe. But on the other side, it's also true that in the 50s and in the 60s, up to the 60s, I mean, there was a very important economic development in Eastern Europe. And it was an economic development which was made without too much, and I'm not talking about the Soviet Union. I'm talking about Czechoslovakia, the German Democratic Republic, and Poland up to the 60s. I'm not talking about later, during which, in fact, I mean, there was less poverty than in other countries during industrialization. So it was also another model, and we have to take it seriously.
So on the question of another model, if you could return to how you begin the book, and then you also shared this in the slide presentation with the example of David Morse, was the Director General of the International Labor Office, and what partly inspired you to explore these alternative paths was the crossed out section. That was a great slide from a document that he produced of his trip to, let's see here, to Poland and Czechoslovakia in 1949. And I don't quite understand what Morse is thinking and or saying as a result of that trip on the one hand, and his reading of American politics, on the other. And the quote goes, in the US state, there was a fear of the USSR, but there was a terrible misunderstanding and misconception between East and West, ... And then he suggests that there are two camps, one hostile and militaristic, but the other, to which he belonged, felt that conciliation was desirable and possible. This latter school was in ascendance, and there would be a great difference visible in U.S. policy within the period of 12 months. I don't know what he's referring to. If you jump ahead 12 months, or rather take it into the summer, it's the Korean War.
Absolutely.
And the Truman administration is not exactly warming up and reconsidering its stance, after the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So what's Morse referring to? Who are his ostensible allies, in this vision? I mean, Henry Wallace runs for president, on a platform that promises, peace with the Soviet Union and a reconstruction of the Grand Alliance, but he gets a handful of votes in several zip codes in New York and California, and a few votes scattered in between. So that's a complete dead end. So what is he referring to? How realistic is it?
I'm exactly like you. I was so surprised. I was so surprised because exactly like you, I don't see what he's referring to. So at the beginning, I thought, okay, so it's only just to please the people in the East in a certain way, kind of diplomatic stance. But on the other side, it is in the report, and they won't read the report anyway. So, and that's true also that he was very warmly welcomed in this country, and Poland and Czechoslovakia didn't leave the ILO and the International Labour Organization, meaning that it was the only organization in which there were still Eastern Bloc countries in that period. So there was something very special about it. And of course, if you look at the Czech archives, and I looked at them, I mean, you understand why, because it's exactly these former social democrats which are who are in a certain way retaining, because they are very powerful in the welfare system, so they are retaining Czechoslovakia in the ILO. So anyway, but it's exactly the reason why I began this book, because I was, how is it possible that somebody who is a director general of an international organization, of the office of the ILO, and who is a US person, but as we know later on, he was very, very much criticized by the US administration. He was criticized as being soft on communism. Also, he was, of course, very anti-communist. And then, he had a very big fight with Mini, the IFL leader and so on. They really fought physically in Geneva. So there were a lot of tensions. And I don't know exactly where he was standing in the midst of this tension in the US apparatus, because of course the US is a big democracy, and it's very difficult in a certain way to say the US is doing that, because you have all these various tendencies and groups in the US administration, and they are not exactly what Mark was saying. They're not going in the same direction. And it's much easier to understand what the USSR is doing, because there is only one direction. But for the US, it's always much more complex, and that's the reason why I was, for example, another story which was also striking to me. It's the Ford Foundation, for example. You know, they begin to do all these programs in the direction of Eastern Europe, really, and it was very clear in the archives, to undermine communism. And it's very clear they want to undermine communism, so they do these fellowships programs. They try to bring, you know, these people from the East to the West, and in order to convince them that the West is much better, and so on and so forth. So, and then it's the middle of the 60s and the beginning, the second half of the 60s, they begin to be really and genuinely interested in what is going on in the East, in particular in the healthcare system. So there are also things which are in a certain way counterintuitive that we have to take seriously in a certain way. And that's what I like in these archives of international organization or association, is that they give us, you know, access to several voices and also alternatives, which are much more difficult to find if we go only in national archives.
Thank you. So we have a comment in the Q&A or question from Andrew Mayer, a longtime attendee and participant in the Washington History Seminar. And he just finished reading a review of Angela Merkel's freedom about her 4-term chancellorship of United Germany. But one of her points was that in living for her first 35 years, largely in the GDR, her point was that she was able to adjust to differing living standards and economic lifestyles, and that the GDR and other Warsaw Pact countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary were not as moribund as the Western allies and the quote-unquote free world implied. Would you have thoughts on the standard of living question there? And then he says, is this a reasonable response to Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe in this period? So
yeah. Oh, thank you very much for this question. I mean, I've worked myself extensively on the GDR. I wrote 2 books. One is translated into English, maybe with a lot of mistakes. I don't know. Thank you, Mark. But in fact, the living standard in the German Democratic Republic, you know, the main issue for these countries, I'm not talking about all the countries. I mean, for example, like in Poland or in Romania in particular, there were a lot of shortages and so on and so forth. In the GDR, it was different. There were no real shortages. It was just that the living, that you had no choice. I mean, if you wanted to go and to buy something, there was only one possibility. But people were not, you know, they were fed. They were housed, even if it was not luxurious at all, exactly the contrary. There was almost no unemployment. There was decreased unemployment, but there was no real unemployment. And there was a lot of, you know, there was daycare and it didn't cost anything and so on and so forth. So there was no freedom. It was a dictatorship. People were not free. But as far as their basic needs were concerned, it was covered. It was covered, and for the German Democratic Republic. And again, I'm not talking about Romania and Poland because it was different. But it was covered in the GDR. It was covered in Hungary, and it was covered also in Czechoslovakia. So. And it's very different from the Soviet Union. Very different from the Soviet Union. In particular, for the GDR. I mean, what you said about the Soviet Union during the Stalin period and also the Khrushchev period. In the GDR, there was more equality. Also, the main inequality in this country was just the access to goods. And if you wanted to have certain goods, I mean, you couldn't have access to certain goods unless you were part of the Communist Party or the part of the what they called intelligence in German. So it was not that the people. I mean, the income doesn't say anything in this country. I mean, the only thing which is important is the way you can access to certain goods which are luxurious, which are difficult to access to.
Yeah, that's right. The nomenclatura distribution system resulted in a high level of inequality that well-connected party officials would gain access to goods that ordinary people couldn't. And there's a chapter again in that book that Anthony Atkinson edited, Handbook of Economic Distribution, that compares the two German states and shows that in every indicator, whether it's equality of income distribution, in particular equality of living standards and other such things, that inequality was a great deal higher in Eastern Germany, precisely because of that, the non-income distribution, that the nomenclatura had access to goods that others did not.
Thank you. I need to make a slight correction when I said that Andrew Meyer had just finished a review of Merkel's Freedom. I read that as he had just read a review of Merkel's Freedom, when in fact he has just finished writing a review of that book. So just wanted to get that record set straight. We've talked a lot about the first half of the book and not so much about the second half. And I just want to ask you to say just a little bit about a third player in this constellation of forces, and that's China, communist China, and the model that it puts forward in competition, not just with the United States and its allies, but with the Soviet Union as well. And so in the latter part of the book, you do address the Chinese government dispatching, medical teams and other things. So to what extent is this a model? And to what extent does this model have any legs?
Thank you for this question. I mean, China is certainly the center of my book because I'm really not a China specialist. And as you know, anywhere China, I mean, mainland China entered international organization very late. So, I mean, they are not the Chinese are not, I mean, mainland China is not in international organization for the most part of my book. So, but something which I found really also, again, surprising is that for a while, the barefoot doctor, I mean, this idea of, a kind of medicine for all, I mean, the preventive medicine for all, became a model in the World Health Organization, and not just in the World Health Organization, also in the FAO. And in a certain way, again, it's something which makes sense from their perspective because the World Health Organization was created with this idea of really making possible for everybody in the world to get access to health and to healthcare. It was at the center of what the World Health Organization was doing, and there was of course this fight within, and it's still going. I mean, it's now I don't know exactly what they're doing because it's very in disarray right now because of what has been done to them recently, but there has always been, this kind of tension within the organization between, providing basic health for everybody, or trying, in fact, to provide curative medicine for a few. in a certain way. And for a while, beginning of the 70s, there was this idea that China was offering a model of preventive medicine for everybody, and a medicine, healthcare, which was affordable for everybody. And it really became a model, like, you know, the Cuban doctors and so on and so forth. It really became a model for the newly decolonized country, which were poor and which could see in what was going on in China, and as a model. And it was promoted by the World Health Organization for a while. Yeah, for a while. So, but it's yeah.
Good. Megan Easley Walsh writes, and here we're going to get presentist. In light of all that is currently happening, I have no idea what she's referring to. Does the international strength of the times offer us any optimism or a path forward for the world today? So you have your historian's hat, you have your citizen's hat. Perhaps the two of you can weigh in on that as we close.
I can tell you only something. I mean, right now in Geneva, I mean, the International Geneva, there is a sense of fear and of because what happens in the US is not just happening in the US. Alas, it's also happening all over the world, as you know. And in Geneva, for example, in certain organizations, most of the people have been fired. In the International Organization for the Migration, for example, I mean, it's almost now 300 people who have been fired because of some funding which doesn't come from the US, which because as we know, I mean, it's complicated how international organizations are funded. They are funded by the states directly, and it has been always calculated proportionally to the GDP and to the population of a country, and that's why, of course, the US is paying more than other countries, which it's just a kind of international redistribution in a way. But now most of the funding for international organizations are coming through kind of voluntary funding from countries or from big philanthropies like the Bill Gates Foundation or whatever, you know, for example, for the World Health Organization. So for some of these organizations, I mean, USAID was very important funding, in particular for the IOM, International Organization of Migration. So they had to fire people. So right now, international organization and multilateralism is really in crisis. I mean, we see it in Geneva. I mean, people are leaving. People are really, I mean, some organizations are almost, you know, almost closing down right now. So it means that all the regulations which have been put in place, I mean, for a very long time, and it was very complicated to put that in place, I mean, is now really endangered. Not completely endangered, but really endangered. Also in the International Labour Organization, there are also people who have been leaving and so on and so forth. And we have to know, I mean, these international organizations, there are small bureaucracy, very small bureaucracy. There are not so many people working in international organizations. It's, for example, the UN, if I remember correctly, it's at the whole, it's 25,000 people. It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. And this is really, this organization right now are really endangered. So is there hope? If there is nothing, if there is no system left in a certain way, just to balance, I mean, the great powers and their quest for power, I don't know. I mean, how I can describe that. I mean, it will be difficult. It will be difficult. So I'm not, usually I'm not a very pessimistic person, But I would hope that at least there is some kind of remaining of an international system. So what I hope is that Europe will be strengthened, that the European will be strengthened by what is happening right now, because they have to resist, and they can resist only together.
I know we've run out of time, Eric, but let me just add one quick thing. I would agree with almost everything that Sandrine just said. The thing that I do think what has happened over the last 3 months or so represents a real abandonment of about 8 decades of U.S. policy. It's not simply a return, and it's not just with regard to international organizations. It's also the dismantling of extremely important institutions like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America. I never imagined that I would see a U.S. president voluntarily dismantle those organizations. There was a threat to them in the late 60s, early 70s after revelations of their secret funding by the CIA. But then Congress reconstituted them. And from then on, they were seen by presidents of both major parties in the United States as extremely important foreign policy tools. And I never imagined I would see a U.S. president dismantle them voluntarily. And the same is true of many other steps. Why the Woodrow Wilson Center was targeted hasn't been explained, and I find it baffling. So I too am quite pessimistic.
And here
I'm optimistic for Europe. I'm optimistic for Europe. You're invited. Come join us.
I go to Europe very frequently. In fact, I'm in Europe right now.
So on that note, I unfortunately have to draw this to a close. I want to express my thanks to Sandrine and Mark for this spirited and fascinating discussion. And I just want to say the Washington History Seminar remains alive and well. And we invite you to join us in 2 weeks' time when we reconvene to explore Erin O'Halloran's new book, East of Empire, Egypt, India, and the World Between the Wars, with discussant Dane Kennedy. Till then, take care, everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Sandrine.
Thank you.